A Manifesto for Hope, Principle 7. Do things with people, not to them or for them. Many of our government-funded systems are failing the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. At the same time, we're sidelining our greatest national asset, local people. We've got a stark choice to keep pouring money into policies we know aren't working, or to invest in new and better ways that really improve people's lives. We need a radical reset, one that empowers local charities, grassroots movements and faith groups in a more imaginative, less bureaucratic, more collaborative approach to community development. I'm Steve Chalk. My book, A Manifesto for Hope, sets out 10 tried and tested practical principles for how to develop joined up, cost-effective, community-empowering work, each gleaned from the hard-won experience that sat at the heart of my work over the past 4 decades. It culminates in a call for a new social covenant, one that will transform the life chances of countless young people and families. It's time to reimagine. It's time for a manifesto for hope. Principle 7. Do things with people, not to them or for them, with my guest and expert witness, Julie Siddiqi MBE. Julie, you're a social entrepreneur and the founder and director of Together We Thrive. So welcome here. Thanks for being involved with this podcast. I couldn't believe it when you said you would be.
No, why would I not be? You know how much I fell in love with this book straight away as soon as you sent it to me. So it seems like a perfect extension of that to have this conversation as part of this wonderful podcast.
When I wrote to you and asked you if you do a quote, an endorsement for the book, I have to say it was fantastic. Some people wrote back and said yes, some people didn't write back at all. But you sent me a WhatsApp voice message that was about 20 minutes long in 2 parts.
No, so look what happened. As I've said to you, when I started reading this book and I saved it, I was going to Dublin, I saved it to read on a plane. I read the book and literally every single page in this book resonated with me. And I'm not even exaggerating that, to the point where I couldn't believe it, page after page. And I had read not even all of it, most of it by then, by the time I got to Dublin. I started recording a voice note in Dublin airport and started crying because I was so emotional about what I'd read in the book. And then I was being picked up by someone who I thought, okay, let me not read the rest, say the rest of this voice note because she's going to wonder what on earth's happening. I then waited. The next morning, I sent you that 17 or 20 minute voice note, which is kind of unheard of, I guess, to just say how much it meant to me, what you'd written in the book. I'm sure it's the biggest voice note you've ever had.
Yeah, by a long way, it has to be said. It was very kind. I listened to it on a train trip from Waterloo. I was going somewhere to speak, and I got to where I was going to speak before the voice message ended. It was fantastic.
But it meant a lot to me, this book. Timing, the tone, the positiveness of it, but the realness of it also. That's what really stood out for me. So, I greatly appreciate this book. So I'll talk about it, forever and ever.
So Julie, that's why I wrote to you and asked you whether you'd get involved with these podcasts, and specifically this principle, this chapter, Principle 7, do things with people, not to them, not for them. Because at school, like most children, I guess, I was taught Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the survival of the fittest. So we all learn about the survival of the fittest. But over the last few years, as I've read, but more importantly, as I've reflected on life, I've realised that the principle of the survival of the fittest doesn't work at all. It's just not true. The principle that works, and lots been written about this, is the survival of the friendliest. In actual fact, if you go back into Charles Darwin's writing and reread it, you realise that he wasn't talking about the survival of the fittest at all. He saw that collaboration, being friendly, that's what led to survival. That's what makes you the fittest, collaboration. So it's not that Charles Darwin was wrong, it's that he got read wrong. He got reported wrong. So when you think about it, just practically, there we are, our ancestors, long, long time ago, and their foe, their enemy, is a saber-toothed tiger. Now, when your enemy's a saber-toothed tiger, the old flight or fight response doesn't work. Flight doesn't work because a saber-toothed tiger's going to outrun you every time and get you. Fight doesn't work because the saber-toothed tiger is a lot bigger than you. So the only way our ancestors actually survived, literally survived, was by learning to work together, learning to collaborate. That's at the basis of what it is to be human. And we now know, don't we, that Homo sapiens have been on Earth for around 200,000 years. Some people say a little bit longer than that, but we've been here for 200,000 years at least. And over that time, we've always lived in small communities. So human life has always been tribal. It's always been in a clan. It's always been in a small, multi-generational group where people live together for 200,000 years. The point is, though, that over the last 200 years, so we've had 199,800 years of living in small communities, and over the last 200 years, we've experimented with this brand new thing, splitting up families, spreading across the country, and the last 100 years, urbanization, etc., and the last 20 years, spend most of your time looking at a screen. It's bound to work. But what we've done is not realised, so say the neuroscientists now, is we've not realised that over those 200,000 years, our brains adapted. We've had 200,000 years of brain development, and our brains are adapted to living in community. We're community animals. We're made for community. So we've even got to this strange place, I always think, where we look at people who live isolated lives. They live on their own and they don't have many friends, and they say, we admire them. We say, they're strong. Aren't they self-reliant? But we're not self-reliant. We were never meant to be self-reliant. Our rather large Homo sapien brains are actually wired for relationship, so that when we organise society in a way that ignores that or minimises that, refuses to put it centrally, our communities and the way we govern them and run them and hope that they'll operate for the well-being of everybody within them, it just falls apart and doesn't work. When our policies don't go with 200,000 years of brain development, they're kind of doomed completely. And in writing this book, which I wrote after the virus, coronavirus, COVID was receding, the pandemic was going. But looking back on COVID, I realised that in the COVID crisis, what was truest to our experience as humans suddenly started boiling up to the surface. Suddenly people realised that knowing their neighbour was really quite important after all. So they ought to go and find out who they were and what their name was. And we started clapping for the NHS and doing all sorts of things. Suddenly we kind of realised that community was quite important to us. And we were struggling without it. And we see this long tail of mental health issues and all the rest of it in children and in adults as well, because we've learned the outworking of community not being there. So what I say in the book is that, strangely, in our society, we're surrounded by more people than ever. We don't live in small communities of 50 or 60 people anymore. We live in huge communities of hundreds and thousands of people. But strangely, though we're surrounded by so many people, we know less people. We don't really know half the time the people who live next door to us or above us. We know, because of Instagram or something like that, we know all about some celebrity who lives in LA and what they have for breakfast, but we've no idea who the person we stand behind in the queue at a little local corner store. And we've done it for years and we've seen them so many, we don't even know their name. But we know all about some dude who lives on the other side of the world, who doesn't know us, doesn't care about us, and even our news. Who says the news is what's happening on the other side of the world when the news should be about what's happening up your street? And so it gives us this sense of impotency as well, doesn't it? Because we hear about all this stuff that we can't do anything about. And the things we could do something about, like the lady up the road who's just had a stroke, or just heard some bad news about her granddaughter and would just love to sit down and have a cup of tea with someone. We don't even know.
Yeah.
So we don't get involved. We are surrounded by people, but we're not connected. So we're surrounded by people, but we're not connected. Everybody on earth grew up within small, interconnected, multi-generational groups. That's how it happened. So no one adult was ever responsible for one child. It was a mum and a dad and a cousin and an aunt and a grandmother and a great-grandmother, and then all of the other people in the collective group, the tribe, the clan, who took responsibility. But now we reach this extraordinary stage where you can be a single mum with 3 kids, and you're supposed to be the breadwinner, go out and earn enough to keep everybody in house and clothes and warm, etc. But then you're supposed to be able to come home, be the cook and the cleaner and the counsellor and the homework specialist and the nurse and the entertainment provider and get everyone ready for bed, do the washing, etc., 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 and do it all on your own. And, the number of people who I meet who you hear them say it, I hear them saying, or I can see it in their eyes, I'm not enough, I can't do this, I just can't do it. So they plunge into depression and anxiety and despair, and they're lonely. I'm not enough. And of course the answer is, of course you're not enough. You were never meant to be enough. We're not supposed to battle through life on our own. We're supposed to be surrounded by people. We're made to work together because we're made for community. And as I was thinking about all of this, some years ago, I have no idea why this happened. The Navajo Indians, who are the largest indigenous tribe in the States, the Navajo, they're bigger than the Cheyenne and all of those ones. The Navajo, they invited me to the Navajo Nation. Now, the Navajo Nation is in New Mexico, etc., etc. It's a huge piece of land. It touches more than one state. But you're only allowed into the Navajo Nation if you have to get a kind of visa from them. They have to grant you this opportunity, but they invited me. And the incredible thing is they invited me to go and speak at a conference about community. And I remember, this is some years ago, I remember thinking, what do I know about community? I'm a kind of Westerner. We're all individualistic, aren't we? We've abandoned community, but they've invited me to speak about community. So anyway, I went out there, and it was wonderful. I stayed there a week, and we did this big conference. But that weekend, in the village where I stayed, there was a couple getting married. They asked me whether I'd stay for the wedding. Now, this was an amazing thing. I had to get home, but I wanted to stay. Then they told me the wedding was going to last for 3 days. So eventually, I rang home and I messed about with the plane and all this kind of thing, and I could stay for a day of it, and not for the last 2 days. And the first day was what they told me was the bride's day. And honestly, I will never forget this. So in the morning, we all gathered on the village square, the village green. It wasn't concrete, but it wasn't green either. It was brown. It was dark. This is like hot, Anyway, so everybody gathers there around this village centre. And then this old guy, a really old guy, by hyperbole, I could say the oldest guy in the village. I don't know if he was, but he was. Perhaps he was. Perhaps that's why he had this kind of big horn. But anyway, he blew it. And when he blew the horn, all of the women in the village started moving to the centre, and the blokes were all sat round the edge, you know, old and young and boys and all the rest of it, and babies. But all of the girls, all of the women started moving to the centre. And there was this one girl, young woman, and I realised she was the bride, and she stood at the head of this kind of, all I can describe it as this huge triangle. And behind her, in fact, I was sat with some men who explained all this to me, was her mother and then their grandmothers. And there was a great grandmother in there and some aunts and some sisters and some cousins and generally then everybody, all of the women, all of the females in the entire village. And they all line up behind the bride. And her mum was hanging on to her, holding her round her waist. And then everybody was holding everybody else. So they was like all joined together. And then the old guy blows this big horn thing again. And everybody starts singing and some drums start beating. And the women, led by the bride, all set off on this jog, basically. And they disappeared from the centre, and then they disappeared. You couldn't see them at all. So I asked this guy I'm with where they've gone, and he told me they were running the whole parameter of the village land. So, you know, the old great-grandmother, I mean, how did she do it? I figure they just carried her. She was a titchy little thing as well. They carried her around, I guess. Anyway, they arrived back, but as they're running round, you know, I'm asking, so what's all this about? And I remember one of them saying to me, well, it's a wedding. It's a wedding. I said, well, they're not like that in England. And I know because I've done a lot because I'm a vicar. And they said, well, you know, they obviously thought we had a lot to learn, you know. And they said, somebody said to me, they said, you know, the thing is, how can that young girl, he was talking about the bride, how can she become the woman she wants to be? How can she become the mother she wants to be? How can she be the wife she wants to be? How can she be the person she wants to be without the support of her mother and her grandmothers and her sisters and her cousins and all of this village? We run the race of life together, and this is a demonstration of that. It's a parable of that. And I said, well, what about the bloke? And they said, it's his turn tomorrow. And I don't know what they did on the third day, but I came away from this thing thinking these people, well, I got there knowing they understood community. Yeah. And I came away with this even deeper, greater sense that they really did know what community was. And one of them said to me in conversation, he said, in the West, and they weren't putting us down at all, and they've got many troubles themselves, but he said, in the West, he said, you know, you have so many therapists, so many professionals. He said, but your therapists are a replacement for community. It wasn't that they were dismissing medicine or dismissing the role of a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but they were saying this deep truth that actually we end up in that position when everything else has failed very often. Yeah. And that's what they provide. And it reminded me of, you know, the church that I'm part of and led for 20 years. I've just stepped down from leading it. I'm still part of it. But anyway, the thing was, in the church, there's a whole South American contingent of families. And then we run a couple of schools in the community. And in the primary school, one of the boys, Timothy, he was given a project, and it was to do an account of the Second World War, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz in London. And I think he was like 8 years old, something like that. And one Sunday, with his mum, he happened to tell me that he got this project from school, you know, and from our school, actually. And I realised that there's an old guy in the church called Sid in his 80s who was a Fleet Street journalist when they had Fleet Street journalists. He was a journalist all the way through the Blitz. That's what he did. So I introduced them to one another. And Sid helped Timothy do his project, which turned out to be the best project in the school. Anyway, but the bit is, Julie, what happened was they struck up this extraordinary friendship. Honestly, it was amazing to see. And this old, Cockney got to know this young South American boy, like so many decades between them. And they became real good friends over the next years. But then some years later, Sid died and I took his funeral. So we had his funeral service and a big crowd came because he was such a popular old guy. Everybody loved him. And then when you take a funeral, the hearse carries the coffin off to the cemetery and the minister of the church rides in the front of the hearse. So I climb in the front of the hearse along with the driver and they're pulling away slowly. They always go slowly down the street. And I see little Timothy standing with his mum on the pavement watching. There were lots of people watching. And I saw Timothy crying. And I've talked to him about it and his mum about it several times since. And I often talk about it because it's one of the greatest things I've ever seen. Because I realised that this boy, in his first years of life, had formed a relationship with an old man from a completely different culture, and they both strengthened one another. Yeah. And it strikes me, that intergenerational community, like, where do you get it from? Yeah. Tell you a funny thing I often do. People will say to me, Steve, I've heard about your church and all that it does and all the stuff in the community, and I'd like to come, but I don't believe in God. People often say that, and I always say, I wouldn't let that get in your way if I were you. Because if you try to get community down the pub, you have to keep buying around, don't you? Yeah, it costs you a fortune, and you're only as good as the last drink you bought. Whereas this is genuine, deep, multi-generational, multicultural community where people love one another. And that's the stuff of life. I've got a friend who worked at Grenfell before the Grenfell Tower disaster of 2017, and he still works there. And he told me this not so long ago. He said that when that disaster happened, 72 people burnt to death. And the tragedy that still overwhelms that community. He said all the statutory services arrived to do their thing. And he said what became really obvious is that none of them were up to it, but it was the local community groups. It was all the informal groups. It was everything that was run by the local people that was faster, fleeter of foot, was more empathetic, more attuned and more able to meet the needs. And so in the book I say, we have to learn this lesson, that you can't build strong community from Whitehall, the diktats of Whitehall, and you can't build it from the town hall and the council house. The problem is that I've learned over the years that government in all its shapes and sizes, local or national, it loves formality, it loves policies, it loves frameworks, it loves everything written down in neat paragraphs on on PDFs, and it spews all this stuff out, and it doesn't like informality. But communities are informal. They don't do formality. You don't fill in risk assessment forms before you pop round to your neighbour for a cup of tea. So government cannot understand community, and it can't measure it, it can't monitor it, it can't write it down, it can't sign it off, it can't tick box it, it can't say, whoa, that's safe. But community doesn't do what government wants. So government and statutory services end up being frustrated by ordinary community members who they find very hard to deal with. Not realising that they're the ones that are hard to deal with, because community is about something different. I read a book by a guy called Garen McGarvey, Darren McGarvey, and it's titled "The Social Distance Between Us." And then the strapline says, "How remote politics wrecks Britain." And he talks about the fact that the further away a decision is made from the people, the more irrelevant that decision always is. In New Zealand, they in the back end of the 80s, they came up with this thing called kinship care, because when a young person was taken into care, they'd had this kind of multi-team, we meet and decide what's good for this child. And they suddenly realised they were leaving out the family, because the child might have been abused within the family, but the family, the wider family, the tribe, the clan, they loved the child and they knew the child. So having this kind of big meeting on the future of the child without the family was a ridiculous thing. And it's become known as kinship care, because often the best carers for that child are other members of the family. Yeah. And it's spread into other countries, and we got bits of it here now, but we've never done it properly. We've never done it properly. And so what I think is this: though we write that phrase everywhere, it takes a village to raise a child. You know that one? Like, I rarely go into a government office without coming across that quote somewhere. It takes a village to raise a child. What we actually believe is it takes a couple of professionals and a spreadsheet to raise a child, or anyone else. And the village is a bit of an annoyance, really. So we can dispense with the village, and it can all be organised by people who don't live in the village, but all drive in cars, 9 to 5, sit in offices, write papers on how all the problems here, and then go away and live somewhere else, totally unknown by the community and totally unknowing of the community. And so this chapter, this principle, to do things with people, not to them and not for them. Nothing about us without us. You know that phrase, nothing about us without us. And it strikes me we've got such a long way to go on that. In Oasis work, we emphasise constantly the role of a community leader. So obviously where we've got schools and community work, you're bound to end up with lots of people who live outside the community. No local community has all the maths and physics and chemistry teachers that are needed for a school. But you've got to have community workers who are part of the community, who shop on those streets, who know the people, et cetera, who feel the stress and the anxiety and the pain and the struggle of that community and its joys and celebrate. So we often call that person a hub leader. What we mean is they're a community development person who works there long term. We're often asked to go into a community and they say, look, we give you a year's money to send someone in and begin stuff. And I always say a decent community worker didn't do anything for the first 6 months except just listen to people and ask them what's going on and work with them. It strikes me that's the difference between service delivery, when you get a grant to run a Pilates class, and everybody rushes into the community and does Pilates because somebody who doesn't live there feels that they've all got to get fit because they're all a bit obese. And so you run your Pilates class for 6 months and then the money runs out and it all stops. But the Pilates class person was a service delivery person, not a community development person, or else when they've been doing the Pilates class, they would have realised that there's someone who used to come, but they've not been there for a few weeks. And they'd go around and find out how they are. And they'd realise that their daughter has just had a brain hemorrhage. Or they'd realise that their mum is unwell. And so they now have to go and help their mum on that night. And then they'd realise that there were other things in the community that were needed and other things that could happen. And do you see? So a community development worker sees things with big eyes and a big perspective. And a service delivery person delivers the service till the money runs out. That's how we spend our money, and it doesn't work. Nothing about us without us. And I once heard someone say about all these community meetings that the professionals have about communities, the problem is that if you're not in the room, you're normally on the agenda. Mm-hmm. And we need to get off the agenda and be invited into the room. That's what this chapter's about.